Right then, now we can move on to the rebuild portion of this video, and we're going to be starting off with the valve core. So I'll just give you the O-rings quickly. These two around the outside here are 19.5s by 1.5s. The one in the base here is a BS006. Finally, the valve, or the firing valve here, the one around the outside of that is a BS111. But I'm going to be leaving the ones that were already on it on my one, as these worked perfectly well before it took it apart, and there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with these ones, so I'm going to be leaving them as they are. I am, however, just going to be putting a small amount of silicone grease over all the O-rings. Next, very carefully, we can drop the valve core in the end here. It goes up this way up in the block, like so. Be very careful as you push the O-rings over this edge here, as it can be quite sharp, and if you tear the O-rings as they go in, they won't seal. There we have it there. You can see that the valve core is lined up nicely with the top. Next, we're going to be putting the magazine indexing pin back. Firstly, we're just going to be putting the O-ring in, and this O-ring is a 2 by 1.5. So we'll drop that in the base there, then using a small Allen key we'll get it seated, like so. Next we'll put the cup back over the top of that, like so. Next the pin goes in long side down, like that. The spring drops over the top, and finally the cover piece goes on over the top of that. And we're going to be doing these screws up with a 2mm Allen key. Nice and even, like so. Next we're going to be putting the coil and the hammer spring assembly in. So in the base here, first thing that goes in is the steel spacer ring. It just drops down to the bottom like so. Next up is the coil, so the coil goes in like so, and we can push that down to the bottom and then poking the wire up back through the hole, like that. Next we can take this dowel ring piece here, and with the slot aligned in the bottom, push that in and get it aligned with the wire. Next we'll drop the hammer in from the back, and also the wave ring. Once that's done, we can take the safety and drop it in the end there, pull this shaft down of the safety and put it back like so. It should lock into place once it's in the correct position. Once that's done, we can take the anti-tamper screws and put them in the side, and finally using the Daystate anti-tamper tool we'll get that done up nice and tight, like so. And I'll do the same for the other side. Next up we can put the safety spring and ball in. First things first, we put the ball in, and I'm just going to be adding a little bit of lithium grease to the ball bearing before it goes in. The lithium grease also acts as a nice little handle, so we're not fumbling around with the ball bearing itself. There it is in there. It can be pushed in from the top, and then we can do a similar thing with the spring itself. So I'm just going to be putting a small amount of lithium grease over the spring, putting a cocktail stick in the side there, and then pushing it in the hole. Nice and easy, like so. Next we're going to be putting the largest ball bearing back in for the safety, and again to that I'm just going to be adding a small amount of lithium grease. This ball bearing's a bit bigger, so I'm going to have to use just a set of tweezers, but we can just drop that in there, and with the safety on safe mode, the ball bearing should go nice and flush, like that. So the large ball bearing goes in this hole here, and the smaller ones go in this side here. Next up we're going to reassemble the cocking arm. So we have the cocking arm and the pellet probe here. We didn't take this bolt out the pellet probe. If you did want to take this out, you do just need to unscrew it with a flat bladed screwdriver. They're not normally extremely tight, but we're going to be just reassembling this one. First of all, I'm just going to be adding some moly grease inside this hole here. This is where the spring and the ball bearing run. So a nice small amount of moly grease. We can take our spring, push that in the hole like so, using a cocktail stick just to push it down, and then we can drop the ball bearing over the top of it like so. Then I'm just going to add a little more moly grease just over the top of the ball bearing. Then we can take our pellet probe with the arm and put it in like so. This is the way round it goes, so curve to the back and pointing forward. Then we can take our screw, flat bladed screwdriver, and use a flat bladed screwdriver to just do that up. Again, you may need to put a little pressure on the top of the arm like so to get the screw to start. But with the grease in there, that's nice and smooth. Next we're going to add the bushing back before the bushing goes in. Just going to add a small amount of lithium grease to the outside of the bush. And I'm also going to add a small amount of lithium grease to the outside of the pellet probe. Just this shaft here, as this is the one that runs in the block. As well as just some in the crevice there. And before this assembly goes back, we will need to put the cover plate on this side. This is the cover plate. Put it in, slide the screw heads across the back like so, so that the side piece is nice and aligned, and then using a 2mm Allen key, do the 2 screws up nice and tight. Once that's done, we can bring back our pellet probe and slide it in the back. And taking our screw, we can put that in the back there and do that up with a 2.5mm Allen key. And with a little bit of grease in there, the cocking arm goes backwards and forwards nice and smoothly. Last thing to add to the cocking arm is just the cocking handle. And we'll do that up nice and tight with a 2.5mm Allen key. Next up we'll put the pressure sensor back on. So just screw that in the end there. And then do that up nice and tight with a 22mm spanner. Next up we're going to reinstall the front block. Before that though, what we will be doing is dropping the valve pin down in the middle. And just put that in like so. And then bringing back the valve block. It has 2 O-rings, these 2 here. And these O-rings are both 19.5 by 1.5 MBR 90s. Again, I'm going to be leaving these ones on. And as you reinstall this front block, just be nice and careful. A light amount of pressure. You don't want to force it and tear those O-rings. But a nice light pressure and it should go on nicely. The front block has 2 different types of screws. It has these shorter ones that go in the top, and then these longer ones go in the bottom. So short ones in the top, long ones in the bottom. Doing those up with a 4mm Allen key. I like to get them all started first, then go round afterwards and tighten them all up to a final torque. As you do that up, just make sure the front block is nice and aligned and it's not majorly off to one side. and then when all the bolts are semi-tight, go round afterwards and just give them that final last bit of tightness. You want those front bolts to be nice and tight. Next up, we're going to reinstall the trigger guard. Now we're going to do this in a little different order in which we took it apart. First thing we're going to do is put the bracket back on itself. So in the base here, line that up nicely, and then using the M6 screw, drop that in the base, and with a 5mm Allen key, just do that up nice and tight. As you're doing it up, just make sure that the base here is located on the square section that's cut out in the block, and that it's got a little bit of wiggle room as you can line it up a little later. Next, what we're going to do is just drop the two small nuts in these two slots here, making sure that they're seated correctly, putting our finger over them and flipping the block over to this side. Next, we're going to take our safety switch, place it in the end there, flick the safety to fire mode, and then just line up and do up these two screws here. Once you've got these two screws semi-tight, just back them off so that the safety is able to move up and down. Then flick the switch onto safe mode, so the back here, switch it to safe mode and get it to a position where the switch is fully depressed but not overly tight. That'll do for now. What we'll do now is we'll tighten this screw up in the back here with a 5mm Allen key so that it's nice and in line with the actual safety bar itself. Now as we flick the safety on and off, the safety switch should fully depress. So if we look at it, the safety could be moved up a little further, so we're going to do that. Just loosen one side off, move it round just very slightly, and then tighten it up into position. And there we have it. As we flick the safety bar is fully depressed, but it's not bottoming out on the actual arm itself, so it's not going to damage the switch. Next thing we're going to do is bring back the board. So we need to put the insulating plate on first, then the board itself, pushing it over like so. We flip the board over. We now need to just give the coil wires a little bit of manipulating to get them to line up. Once that's done, once that's in position, we can take this cover here with the window cut out and lay that over the top. Line up the screws with their respective holes. And do them up nice and tight. I like to get them all started first, then go round and do them up tight. There we have it there. Next we can start reconnecting some of these wires. The first one we're going to do is the safety one on the bottom there. So as you can see, nice and easy, just place them in nice and gently, and the same thing for the pressure sensor. Place the switch in the housing itself, then gently pushing on the plastic connection will get that seated. Next up we'll take our battery wire and we'll fish it through the back. Pull it through and then finally connect it in the side there. And there we have it. Then we'll just pull the slack out of the wire and push it to where it needs to be. Next up, what we're going to do is re-loosen the trigger plate and reconnect the valve core wires. The reason I like to do it this way is because we line up the safety switch first, get that in the correct position, put the board back on, and we're no longer able to adjust the safety position, but we can just loosen that off like so, push the coil wires down, get them lined up in the slots, and then just do the two connections up there with a 3mm wide flat bladed screwdriver, like so, and then simply re-put the trigger guard in position, or the trigger plate, and then do the screw back up. That way we keep the safety position so that it still works. As you can see there, the safety is still in the right position and it still works. And obviously as you tighten that back up, make sure that the block is nice and in line. Next thing we're going to do is reattach the trigger switch. So first things first, fish it through the hole in the bottom there. I'm going to plug mine in, so we'll plug it in at the base here, that connection there, and then lining the trigger up in the middle there. We'll drop the two screws in. And that's these screws here, like so. There's the trigger switch installed. So now we'll reinstall the trigger. So firstly we'll rebuild the trigger, quite simply. Put the trigger blade through the hole there, reline the trigger itself with the hole in the plastic guard, push the pin through, and then we can reattach the trigger to the base here using these two screws. So these ones here, we'll drop them in, one in the front, one in the back, and then we'll do them up using a 3mm Allen key. And there we have it, that's the trigger reinstalled. So now we'll drop the front plate over the top. So here's the front plate, just make sure all the wires are in a nice position. Drop the front plate over the top, and before we close it up we've just got to make sure that these wires here aren't pinched. So we'll get a screwdriver or something similar, just tease the wires into one of these cutouts here. Like so. Then we can just do these three screws up. And then finally the one at the back, just make sure that the battery wire is nice and free, and do that one up as well. And then once they're all done up, make sure that the pressure wire sensors can move nice and freely, which these ones can. Next up we'll put the Foster fitting onto the front block. So we have the components here. The Foster fitting itself has a dowty washer on the end here, and then the one-way valve has a urethane BS006 O-ring on it, so that one there. And before that goes in, we're just going to add a small amount of silicone grease to the O-ring there, wiping off the excess with our fingers, placing it in the end there. Next, we're going to drop this little cup, so cup side up, into the hole. Then we're going to screw the Foster fitting over the end of it. Doing that up nice and tight with a 5/8 ring spanner. Next up we'll reattach the bottle. So the bottle has an O-ring in it, and this is a BS617 MBR70. So we'll put a good amount of silicone grease on that before that goes on. Stick it in the end of the bottle like so, and then do the bottle up. Doing that nice and tight by hand. Right then, so we'll put the block to one side and I'll bring back the barrel and we'll get started on the shroud. So the first thing we're going to do is reattach the shroud clamping at the back, and to do that we'll bring back the original piece and line up these two grub screws here with the two indentations on the barrel. So if we take one of the grub screws out, we can line it up and then do the grub screw back up, like so. Next, on this end we can refit the screw-on fitting at the end there. And if you did need to change the O-ring on the end, it's a BS114. The ones on the shroud fitting at the back here are BS017s. And then we'll slide the shroud back over the end there. Lining up the two holes in the shroud with the two holes in the shroud connection piece at the end there, and then placing the grub screws in the two holes, doing them up with a 2.5mm Allen key, like so. Right then, that's the barrel and the shroud fully reassembled. So the final thing we'll do is talk about these two O-rings at the back. So these ones on the sub 12 rifles with the sub 12 barrels are 10x1s, MBR 70, and the FAC models have a larger shank, so the O-rings are slightly larger, and they are 12x1s, same MBR 70s. And then the breech seal as spec'd by Daystate, this is a 2.2 rifle, so, and they spec a 5x1.5mm O-ring. With that out of the way, we'll add a small amount of silicone grease to these two O-rings here, and then we'll refit the barrel onto the rifle. The transfer port hole at the bottom there, aligning with the bottom. With that in, we can take one of these grub screws out using a 2.5mm Allen key, line the indentations up to top dead centre, and refit the grub screw, doing those up nice and tight with a 2.5mm Allen key. And there we have it. There is the rifle fully reassembled. With the rifle fully reassembled, the last thing we can put on is the stock. So this is the red stock that we took off, and we're going to be putting that back on. First thing to do is to get the stock at a slight angle and locate the hole in the base there. So that hole there, the battery wire has to travel through that. So nice and carefully place the action in the stock, feeding the wire down as it goes in. And when we get to about halfway, like so, we flip the stock over and just make sure that the battery wire comes out the tip of the stock, like so. Then we can take our stock bolt and do that up using an 8mm Allen key. Now before we do the stock bolt up tight, just make sure that the battery wire feels nice and free and that there's plenty there. Once that's done, we can refit the battery. So pulling the battery connection to the front there, and then dropping the battery in the hole, pushing it down till it stops. Next we can just plug in the battery, like so, fold the wires down neatly and close the battery cover. And there we have it. The last thing we can replace is the fill cap, and that is the rifle fully reassembled. And if we take a look on this side, we see that the bolt has lit up and it's erroring out low pressure. This is because there's no air in the rifle at the moment. So I'll get a bottle and I'll fill the rifle up. And there we have it. I've just put 140 bar in it, or 142 bar in the rifle, and we'll leave the rifle overnight now to make sure it's not leaking. The rifle has now been left overnight and we've made sure that it's not leaking. We filled the rifle originally up to 142 bar, and when we came to check on it in the morning, it had dropped very slightly down to 140 bar. Now I don't think this is because of a leak. I think it's much more likely that when we filled the bottle up, the bottle warmed up slightly, and as it's cooled down overnight, the pressure inside the bottle has dropped. We did leave it a further 6 hours just to make sure that that was the case, and the pressure didn't drop any more. The other thing we've done to the rifle is check it over the chronograph to make sure that it's nice and consistent and still well within the sub 12 pound limit. With that all done, the rifle's pretty much done now. So hopefully from this little video you can see that there's nothing to worry about on the Daystate Redwolfs, and although they are electronic and they do work a little differently to most modern PCPs, there's nothing inside these things that's inherently scary. With that being said, I hope this video was useful and thank you for watching.